In the late summer of 1942, farmers outside Ypsilanti, Michigan woke to the sound of engines, not airplanes, but trucks. Lines of them, moving down dirt roads before dawn. Men in plain clothes stepped out, carrying clipboards instead of rifles. They walked the fields, measuring, nodding, saying nothing. Within a week, fences appeared. Then signs, U.S. government property, no trespassing. Locals asked questions, but nobody had answers. It's a new army base, some said. Maybe a camp for prisoners, guessed others. But the truth was stranger. Behind those fences, America was building something no one had ever seen before. A city made entirely for war, yet invisible to most of the country. A journal entry from an engineer at Ford Motor Company reads, "They told us we're building the biggest factory in the world. We have 90 days. That's all. 90 days to raise a city from mud and cornfields." Every hour mattered. Bulldozers carved through farmland day and night. Cement mixers hummed like bees. The smell of wet concrete mixed with diesel and sweat. There were no signs, no uniforms, no flags, just urgency. Workers slept in trailers and ate from tin plates in a canteen without windows. The project had a name that meant nothing. IPSI 12. On a government map, it was a white rectangle marked Top Secret. The rest of the page was blank. Even the engineers didn't know what would roll out of this place once it was finished. Some whispered it would be a new kind of tank. Others said aircraft parts. One old foreman muttered, "They're building the future, and they don't even know it." By September, the heat gave way to cold winds off Lake Erie. Still, the floodlights burned all night. The workers came from everywhere: Detroit mechanics, Kentucky farmers, women whose husbands had gone overseas. Trains brought in steel by the ton, glass by the mile, and workers by the thousands. A cafeteria designed for 5,000 now fed 20,000. The roads in Ypsilanti clogged with dust and voices from every accent in America. In the middle of it all, a tall man in a gray suit visited once a week. Henry Ford himself. He walked the muddy ground in silence, hat pulled low, staring at blueprints that looked more like a battle plan than a construction project. To his chief engineer, he said quietly, "They want us to build a machine that makes machines. Let's see if the world's ready." What they were building stretched beyond logic. A mile-long structure of glass and steel, a roof wider than an airfield, a place where time itself would become mechanical. The locals started calling it the monster. Others, the sleeping giant. From the highway, it looked like a mirage, shimmering in the heat, too large to be real. A night guard later recalled, "You'd stand there under the floodlights and look across the whole thing, for walls disappearing into fog. You felt small, like standing at the edge of a storm." Every piece of it was calculated. The walls reinforced for explosions. The floor, thick enough to carry aircraft. A single line ran from one end to the other, empty for now, but built for motion. It was a heartbeat waiting to start. The newspapers in Detroit printed vague reports about industrial expansion. No one mentioned Ford or the government contracts that funded it. The war was swallowing cities whole: London, Kiev, Singapore. And here, in the quiet heart of America, another city was being born. By October, the weather turned. The rain came down in gray sheets, turning the construction site into a swamp. Men worked ankle-deep in mud, stringing power lines while lightning flashed above the cranes. They didn't stop. They couldn't. At night, when the wind howled through the unfinished walls, it sounded like engines warming up. A sign appeared on the main gate in black paint: 90 days or bust. Someone added a smaller note beneath it: "And God help us if we bust." Inside the camp, the rumors kept growing. A worker from Dearborn swore he saw the plans: some kind of flying machine, big as a barn. A woman on the welding crew said she heard Washington wanted 500 of whatever it was. The foreman stayed silent. Only the constant flow of steel and rivets told the truth. Whatever they were building, it was meant to fly. On December 1st, 90 days after the first fence post went up, the whistles blew. The last beam was raised, the last bolt tightened. Floodlights snapped on, revealing a structure so vast that it cast its own horizon. From the air, it looked like an entire city, complete with its own rail lines, water towers, and power grid. But there were no street names, no mailboxes, no people living there. Just corridors echoing with footsteps and the hum of new machines. An engineer wrote that night, It's finished. We built a city of steel and silence. Tomorrow, they'll tell us what it's for. At dawn, trucks rolled in carrying crates marked Pratt and Whitney engines. Guards checked papers at every gate. The air smelled of oil and promise. The workers gathered near the edge of the runway. Yes, there was a runway now, freshly paved and pointing east. The foreman looked at his watch and said, "Gentlemen, the clock starts now." He didn't mean construction time anymore. He meant history. That morning, the sun rose over a field that no longer existed, replaced by glass, metal, and the steady thrum of generators. In 90 days, America had built something impossible, a city that shouldn't exist. And hidden inside its walls, the engines of war were about to wake. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. When the factory came alive, it didn't sound like work. It sounded like thunder. The year was 1943. Outside, snow buried the fields of Michigan, but inside Willow Run, the air shimmered with heat. Metal screamed against metal, sparks fell like stars, and the floor trembled with a rhythm that never stopped. What they had built wasn't just a factory. It was a living organism, a city under one roof. Ford called it the machine that makes machines, and no one who worked there doubted it. The plant stretched nearly a mile from end to end, wider than the Pentagon, with its own rail yard, hospital, post office, and police force. 40,000 people worked in shifts so constant that the lights never went out. Every 63 minutes, a bomber emerged from the assembly line. A B-24 Liberator for engines, 65,000 parts, and a heartbeat of its own. The first time it happened, workers stopped what they were doing and applauded. Some wept. It was as if the building itself had given birth. Henry Ford's dream had become a miracle of motion. Assembly lines that once built sedans now carried fuselages, wings, and gun turrets. Instead of steering wheels, women tightened bolts on bomb racks. Instead of dashboards, men painted tail numbers in black. Every sound, the hiss of air tools, the clang of rivets, the growl of cranes, became part of the war's mechanical symphony. A young woman named Alice King wrote to her brother overseas, "They say we're the arsenal of democracy. I don't know about that. But I do know I've drilled 1,000 holes today, and each one feels like a promise that you'll come home." Willow Run changed everything, not just for the war, but for America itself. Women made up a third of the workforce. Grandmothers learned to weld. Teenagers learned to read blueprints. Cafeterias served meals around the clock. The canteen smelled of coffee, grease, and exhaustion. When one shift ended, another began, 24 hours of perpetual motion. But the miracle came at a cost. The plant was too big, too fast, too new. Conveyor belts jammed. Paint cracked in the cold. Rivets loosened under vibration. Engineers slept under their desks. A machinist remembered hearing the voice of Charlie Sorensen, Ford's production chief, shouting over the noise. "If this place stops, boys, so does the war." They didn't stop. They worked through fevers, through blackouts, through Christmas. When the factory flooded during a January thaw, workers waded in water up to their knees to keep the machines running. One man wrote in his diary, "You could feel the war right here, under your boots. Every screw we dropped was another second someone might die." Visitors called it an industrial miracle. Reporters weren't allowed past the gate, but rumors spread. A bomber every hour, a city that breathes aluminum. Willow Run became a myth whispered in train stations and shipyards. For the first time, production itself became a weapon. There were moments of silence too. At shift change, when the engines cooled for a few minutes, the whole factory seemed to hold its breath. You could hear the creak of metal settling, the distant cry of a train. Then someone would shout, "Back to it," and the thunder began again. One night, the foreman stopped by a crew assembling wing sections. He looked at their tired faces and said, "These wings aren't for flying. They're for carrying someone home." Nobody answered, but after that, the work went faster. By March 1943, Ford's machine that makes machines reached its stride. The numbers defied belief. 650 planes a month, 500,000 rivets a day, a new kind of speed America had never known. The Army called it industrial warfare. Ford called it efficiency. To the people inside, it was just survival, a battle of will and steel fought under a roof instead of a sky. Yet even as production soared, secrecy deepened. Workers were forbidden to discuss what they built. Letters were censored. On paydays, guards watched the exits to ensure no blueprints left the premises. The entire plant was ringed with floodlights and barbed wire. At night, it looked less like a factory and more like a fortress. Still, inside that fortress, humanity persisted. Someone strung Christmas lights above the welding line. A pianist played Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy on an old upright in the cafeteria. Laughter cut through the noise for a moment, until the whistle blew again. On a cold March morning, the first completed B-24 rolled toward the hangar doors. Its skin gleamed silver under the floodlights. Workers lined the floor as the engines roared to life, shaking the rafters. Someone started singing the national anthem, off-key but loud. The bomber began to roll down the runway, its shadow swallowing the crowd. As it lifted into the gray sky, a woman in a blue kerchief whispered, "That's my plane." Nobody answered. They just watched until it vanished into the clouds. Hours later, the next one came off the line, and then another. Every 63 minutes, a heartbeat of war. They had done it. Willow Run had turned raw steel into flight, fear into motion, and ordinary people into the invisible engine of victory. And yet, outside its gates, the world still had no idea what had just been born. By the spring of 1943, the skies above Michigan had become a secret highway. Every night, engines roared to life over the frozen fields of Willow Run. The ground shook, windows rattled for miles, and then silence. The planes climbed into darkness, one after another, vanishing before the sun rose. By morning, the factory looked untouched, as if nothing had moved at all. The locals started calling it the city that disappeared at dawn. Even the workers inside didn't know where the planes went. Pilots arrived with sealed envelopes and no insignia on their jackets. They were told only when to take off, never where to land. One of them, Lieutenant Frank Porter, wrote later, "We took off into blackness. No flight plan, no return coordinates. Only the wind and the sound of 4 engines. I remember thinking, maybe this is what ghosts feel like." Every detail of Willow Run was designed for secrecy. Production schedules were coded. Blueprints were locked in steel cabinets. Each shift worked on a different section of the same aircraft, unaware of how the pieces fit together. Even the janitors signed non-disclosure papers. What they were building didn't officially exist. To the German intelligence network, this was impossible. They tracked train shipments, fuel usage, and aluminum orders, and came to a baffling conclusion. The United States must have at least a dozen secret factories scattered across the continent. In 1944, an intercepted Nazi report to Berlin read, "Enemy aircraft output exceeds known capacity. Suggest additional sites in Texas, Kansas, or Canada." There were no additional sites. There was only one, Willow Run. The deception worked perfectly. To the outside world, the plant was just another industrial project. But to the Army Air Forces, it was a beating heart, one that never stopped. Its pulse sent waves of silver bombers across the Atlantic, unseen and unstoppable. The flights always launched at night. The hangar doors would open, releasing a rush of cold air and exhaust fumes. Workers stood at a distance, their faces orange in the floodlights, as the bombers rolled out one by one. The engines coughed, caught, and thundered to life. Then the lights dimmed. The first aircraft lifted, wings glinting against the moon. The next followed, and the next, until the sky itself seemed to hum. Then came the silence, the kind that fills your chest like a held breath. Only the empty runway remained, shining with frost. Alice King, the riveter who once wrote to her brother, remembered those nights years later. We'd watch them disappear into the dark and wonder, did they make it? We never knew. All we could do was keep building. The government ensured no one would ever piece the truth together. Newspapers were forbidden to photograph the plant. Reporters who tried were escorted off the property. The official story was that Willow Run produced a variety of aviation components. Nothing more. The idea that an entire air fleet could emerge from one building was considered too extraordinary and too dangerous to be public knowledge. Inside the plant, rumor filled the silence. Some said the planes went straight to England. Others whispered about a ghost base in Greenland, where the aircraft refueled before vanishing again. A few thought they were decoys, meant only to trick the enemy. "We built dreams," one machinist said. and then watched them fly away. But the truth was much simpler and much more extraordinary. The liberators built at Willow Run became the backbone of the Allied air offensive. They bombed submarine pins in France, bridges in Holland, and rail yards in Germany. Entire cities trembled under the wings that had once been shaped by Michigan hands. And not one enemy agent ever traced a single bomber back to where it was born. There were nights when the fog was so thick that the floodlights barely touched the runway. Planes rose into the clouds and vanished completely, sound swallowed by mist. It looked like heaven taking them back, one worker said. Sometimes, when the air was still, the returning supply planes from the East Coast would glide overhead just before dawn, their shadows crossing over the roofs of the sleeping town. Children would wake to the sound, press their faces to the glass, and see nothing. Only the echo. One of Ford's senior engineers described it best. We built a city that worked like a clock, but it was built to disappear. It lived between dusk and dawn, between secrecy and thunder. By late 1944, Willow Run reached full momentum. Over 8,600 B-24 liberators rolled out of the factory's endless corridors. Each one was identical, and each one carried the same silent message stamped on its frame: made in the United States of America. Yet none of those words appeared in the newspapers. Not one photograph of the assembly line was released during the war. The workers of Willow Run watched the headlines from Europe: Berlin bombed, Cologne in flames, Dresden burns, and never saw their name printed once. And that was the point. Their success depended on their invisibility. The plant was meant to exist in the shadows, to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The day Allied bombers reached Berlin in 1944, the German High Command held an emergency meeting. The question on the table: where are these planes coming from? No one had the answer. The best spies in Europe failed to find a single photograph, a single report, a single trace. In truth, the answer was 4,000 miles away, hidden behind a chain-link fence in Michigan, where dawn broke over an empty runway and a factory that slept with its lights still burning. They had built a city out of secrecy, and at sunrise, it disappeared again. By February 1944, Europe looked up and saw a new kind of storm. It didn't come from clouds, but from engines, hundreds of them, rolling through the sky like thunder over the sea. German radar operators screamed into their headsets, voices breaking under static. Massive formations incoming. Thousands. The Luftwaffe commanders couldn't believe it. The Americans weren't just attacking, they were multiplying. Each dawn brought more silver wings, more bombers gleaming like sunlight on water. They are not aircraft, one officer muttered, staring at the horizon. They are a tide. It began with Operation Big Week. February 20th, 1944, a clear, brittle morning. The air over England shimmered with frost as 3,500 heavy bombers lined up for takeoff. 400 of them carried no known base designation. Their serial numbers had no origin in any British or American log. Yet there they were, engines humming in perfect rhythm, ghosts built of steel and willpower. Those were the planes from Willow Run. The airmen didn't know it, but they were flying the secret heartbeat of America. Machines born from the hands of factory workers who'd never see the ocean, let alone Europe. On the nose of 1B-24, the crew painted 3 words in white letters: built in 90 days. When asked what it meant, their captain shrugged. "It's where we came from," he said, "even if we don't know where that is." At 10:15 a.m., the first wave crossed the French coast. The sky over Normandy darkened with contrails. Below, villagers stopped and looked upward, shading their eyes against the glare. They had seen bombers before, but never like this. Endless lines of silver machines moving in disciplined silence, stretching from horizon to horizon. In Berlin, Luftwaffe intelligence sent an urgent message to High Command. Enemy production exceeds all calculations. Unknown factories must exist in multiple regions. The scale is unnatural. To the Germans, it felt like an impossible magic, a nation building planes faster than they could be shot down. One colonel wrote in his report, "We do not fight an army anymore. We fight an industry. The sky itself has become their factory." The phrase stuck. In the air, the sound was unbearable, a single, unified roar that made even seasoned pilots shudder. From the cockpits of German fighters, the horizon seemed alive, rippling with light and motion. Pilots later said it felt like watching the ocean come to life above them. And then came the silence. Explosions tore through the airfields below, flames devouring hangars, fuel depots, rail lines. The B-24s flew straight and steady, their bomb bays yawning open, their payloads falling like rain. The noise stopped for an instant, that breath before impact, and then the earth itself answered, shattering into dust and fire. Over the radio, an American crewman whispered, "God forgive us." By dusk, smoke rose from half a dozen cities. In the confusion, German units reported phantom squadrons, aircraft appearing where no radar had detected them. They tried to find the bases. They searched France, Belgium, even Switzerland. None existed. What they couldn't see, what no one outside America knew, was that many of these bombers had left from nowhere. From a nameless place on a map, born in silence, fueled in secret, launched in the night. Back at Willow Run, the production line didn't pause to celebrate. The war still needed more wings, more thunder. For every plane that fell, 2 more were being built. The workers followed the news in silence, tracing the headlines with oil-stained fingers. Berlin bombed again. Hamburg in flames. They recognized the numbers, B-24, B-17, but not their own part in them. Alice King, the riveter who once wrote letters to her brother, stood outside the factory one night, watching contrails drift across the Michigan sky. She whispered to a coworker, "If they ever come home, I hope they fly over us." The woman beside her nodded. "They already have," she said. "We just didn't look up in time." The success of Big Week marked the turning point of the air war. The Allies gained control of the skies, and from then on, Germany's factories burned faster than they could rebuild. But no one, not even the pilots themselves, fully understood where the endless stream of aircraft came from. In his final wartime report, a Luftwaffe officer wrote in despair, "We are drowning in American air. They make machines faster than we can destroy them. It is as if the sky itself manufactures their weapons." The irony was that, in a sense, he was right. Because somewhere across the ocean, a city built in 90 days had become exactly that, a machine that made sky. At dawn, when the survivors of Big Week returned to England, they looked out across the airfields filled with smoke and wreckage. The bombers that made it home lined up like soldiers at rest. On one of their battered wings, grease and ash formed strange streaks that caught the light. A crew chief traced the lines with his hand and said softly, "Looks like America painted itself across the heavens." He wasn't wrong. From that week forward, the war belonged to the air. And the air, whether anyone admitted it or not, belonged to Willow Run. The sky had turned American. And beneath it, in another part of the country, engineers were already breaking ground on a new kind of secret, one that wouldn't rise toward the clouds, but burrow beneath them. By late 1944, the war had turned, but America didn't slow down. If anything, the work went deeper, literally. While the skies above Europe filled with bombers from Willow Run, new projects began to take shape beneath American soil. They called them temporary research sites, but the guards, the fences, and the silence said otherwise. Across the country, hidden towns began to appear. Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Los Alamos in New Mexico, Hanford in Washington. No one outside the government knew what they were for. To most, they looked like small cities surrounded by barbed wire, their lights burning all night long. Workers arrived on buses with no windows, signed papers they couldn't read, and vanished underground. It was the same blueprint as Willow Run: speed, secrecy, and faith. The same engineers who once built bombers now designed reactors and laboratories. The same foremen who managed riveters now oversaw physicists. One official put it bluntly, "We've learned how to build secrets." These new factories had no windows and no skyline. Inside, corridors stretched for miles, lined with humming pipes and flickering bulbs. The air smelled of oil, metal, and fear. Machines whined day and night, but no one could say what they made. A young engineer later recalled, "We knew it was dangerous. We just didn't know for whom." Meanwhile, the Germans watched their empire crumble. Their last reports spoke in riddles. "The Americans," one officer wrote, "have created factories that move. Production that cannot be bombed, because it no longer stands still." He wasn't far from the truth. America had learned to hide its strength in plain sight, in noise, in shadows, and now underground. For those who lived inside these secret towns, life felt both ordinary and unreal. Cafeterias served meatloaf and coffee under fluorescent lights. Children played near fences that hummed with electricity. The workers built homes, schools, and dance halls, all inside places that officially didn't exist. When someone asked where they worked, they simply said, the plant. In Michigan, at Willow Run, the rhythm of the assembly line never stopped. But for Alice King, the woman who had spent years driving rivets into steel wings, something changed. One winter morning, she received a telegram. Her brother's B-24 had gone down over Europe. No survivors. She read the message in silence, then folded it and placed it in her lunch pail. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "The war took him from the sky, so I'll keep building them, as many as it takes." The next day, she came to work early. Her foreman offered condolences. She only nodded and picked up her drill. The sound of it filled the hangar, a steady, defiant rhythm that matched the heartbeat of every hidden factory across the country. America was fighting on two fronts now, one in the air, one beneath the ground. And though no one said it aloud, they all understood. These secret cities were more than just weapons. They were promises, proof that ordinary people could build hope faster than the world could destroy it. As 1945 approached, the underground projects reached completion. Scientists whispered about a superweapon, something that could end the war in a single flash. At Oak Ridge, the air shimmered with heat from the reactors. In Los Alamos, guards patrolled tunnels that glowed faintly blue. The workers didn't ask questions. They had learned that in America's new war, silence was part of victory. And yet, through all of it, one truth remained. The same hands that built the bombers built these secret worlds. The same country that turned sky into steel was now bending light itself. They built cities to build hope, an engineer said years later. They didn't know what it would cost. When the end finally came, the mushroom clouds over Japan, the surrender, the silence, the workers of Willow Run watched the headlines with mixed hearts. They had won the war, but the price was unknowable. Their cities, both above and below the ground, had changed the course of history. And then, almost overnight, those cities disappeared. In September 1945, the gates of Willow Run swung open for the first time without guards. The war was over. The roar of engines was gone, replaced by the slow hum of cicadas in the grass. For 3 years, the plant had worked like a living organism, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now it exhaled. The last bomber had left months earlier. The assembly line stood still, its long spine of steel and rubber now gathering dust. A few workers wandered through the hangars, looking at the silent machines as if they might wake up again. Someone scrawled on a wall in chalk, "Finished fighting. Back to living." Ford announced layoffs the next week. Within a month, 40,000 people were gone. The cafeterias emptied, the buses stopped running, and the lights that had once glowed through the night went dark one by one. A foreman named Charles Emery told a reporter years later, "It was strange. You'd walk through that place and swear you could still hear the echo of the line. Like the ghosts of all those planes we built were still flying above us." Nature crept back in quickly. Grass pushed through the cracks in the runway. Rain pooled in the empty loading bays. A few local kids snuck inside and rode their bikes down the mile-long corridors. They didn't know that those same halls had once produced the wings that freed a continent. To the government, Willow Run became just another number, another site to repurpose, another miracle to file away. Reports were boxed, stamped confidential, and locked in Washington basements. The workers went home to farms and small towns, their stories untold. 30 years later, in 1975, the files were finally declassified. Historians opened the boxes expecting technical blueprints. Instead, they found faces. Thousands of them, women with scarves tied around their hair, men in overalls grinning under the skeletons of bombers, notes scribbled in pencil on grease-stained paper. One caption read simply, "First shift, 1943. We were tired, but we kept going." Another photo showed Alice King, smiling faintly, her eyes shadowed by the same weariness shared by millions. Her grandson, interviewed decades later, said, "She never talked about it. She'd say she just turned bolts. But I think she knew. I think they all knew." The world had moved on. Jet engines, rockets, the Cold War. But the lessons of Willow Run remained buried under the noise. For a moment in history, a factory had become something greater than metal and rivets. It had become proof of what people could do when there was no time for doubt. One of the last surviving engineers described it this way: "We didn't win the war because we had better weapons. We won because we built faster than despair. That was our secret." By the 1950s, the plant briefly reopened to build civilian aircraft. But it never felt the same. The urgency was gone. The workers returned, older now, quieter. When they looked at the empty frames, they didn't see airplanes, they saw memory. And yet, even in silence, Willow Run lived on. Parts of its design inspired future factories. Its methods shaped industries that would one day build not bombers, but cars, homes, and computers. Every blueprint that carried its DNA became a quiet tribute to what America could make when it believed in itself. Decades later, on a summer afternoon, a television crew filmed what remained. The camera moved through cracked floors, rusted cranes, and long corridors filled with dust. At the far end, someone had hung an old sign. The paint was faded, but the words were still legible. "One plane every hour." The narrator's voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "This isn't a story about airplanes. It's a story about what people can build when they decide not to stop." He paused, letting the silence speak. Then, faintly, from a distant loudspeaker, an old wartime recording of Bing Crosby, singing, "I'll Be Home for Christmas." The music filled the empty hangar, echoing through decades of forgotten history. It mixed with the faint whistle of wind through the broken windows, like the sound of wings. Alice King once said near the end of her life, "I didn't go to war. I just showed up for work." She smiled when she said it, though her hands trembled slightly. Turns out that was enough. And maybe that was the truest thing about Willow Run. It wasn't built by generals or politicians. It was built by hands, millions of them, turning bolts, pressing steel, holding faith. They didn't march. They didn't fight. But they built the sky that others flew in. History remembers the battles. It rarely remembers the builders. But sometimes, when the morning sun catches the rusted metal just right, the old factory glows silver again, like the wings that once left its gates. The city that was never supposed to exist had already done its job. It had saved the world.